The ballroom was buzzing with energy, filled with the kind of excitement that only a wedding could inspire. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting soft light across the sea of elegantly dressed guests. The bride, a picture of grace and beauty, stood at the altar. Her white gown shimmered in the soft glow of the candles, and her smile was radiant, until, without warning, everything changed. A loud crash shattered the moment. The heavy ballroom doors flew open with such force that the wood groaned under the pressure. All eyes turned to the entrance, where a woman, breathless and disheveled, stood in the doorway. She was not dressed for a wedding, far from it. Her clothes were simple, her hair tangled, and her face, pale from exhaustion, was framed by strands of hair sticking to her forehead. But what struck everyone in that moment, even more than her disheveled appearance, was the unmistakable curve of her pregnant belly. The entire room fell silent. The bride's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but in that fleeting moment, the groom, whose face was twisted in both surprise and confusion, stepped forward, eyes narrowing. His hands trembled, and his breath hitched. The sudden realization of the woman's presence began to settle over him like a heavy weight. And it wasn't a weight he wanted to carry. Before anyone could speak, before anyone could react, the woman began walking toward him, her eyes locked on his. She wasn't hesitating. She wasn't uncertain. Every step she took seemed to hold a purpose, an unspoken promise of something that was about to be revealed. The groom took a step back as though the space between them would shield him from whatever was coming next. The room was filled with a tense, electric silence. The bride's eyes darted from the woman to the groom, her mouth slightly agape, her grip on the bouquet tightening. What is this?" The groom's voice cracked, his breath shallow. "Who the hell are you?" But it wasn't the woman's face that answered him. It was the words she spoke, quiet but firm, cutting through the thick silence. "I'm carrying your child," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. The shockwave that rippled through the room was palpable. It was as though the air itself had been sucked out of the room. The bride's face drained of color, her hands shaking as she clutched her bouquet. The groom, his body stiff and frozen, couldn't move. The words hung in the air like a suffocating fog. For a long moment, no one moved. The guests stood frozen in place, eyes wide, mouths agape. Time seemed to slow, and the world outside the ballroom disappeared entirely. The groom's chest heaved with disbelief, his mind racing. How could this be happening? Why had she come here, at his wedding, of all places? Then, without warning, the groom's body jerked forward. In one fluid motion, his palm connected with the woman's cheek with a sharp crack, the sound of the slap ringing out in the shocked silence. Her head whipped to the side, and she staggered for a brief moment, but she didn't fall. She didn't flinch. Her eyes remained locked on his, unwavering. The bride gasped, her hands going to her mouth, her eyes flicking between the woman and the groom, unable to comprehend what was happening. The guests, too, seemed frozen, caught in the tension that hung thick in the air. For a long moment, no one said a word. The slap, though loud, felt as though it had broken something more than just the silence. It felt like a crack in the very foundation of everything that had seemed so perfect up until now. The woman, still holding her ground, touched her cheek, a faint red mark left in the wake of the slap. Her expression remained unreadable, but there was a fire in her eyes, a fire that hadn't been extinguished by the blow. Slowly, she spoke again, her voice quieter now, but the words carried a weight that was impossible to ignore. "I didn't come here to hurt anyone," she said, her voice strained but steady. "But I'm not leaving without telling the truth. I'm carrying your child, and it's time you faced it." The groom took a step back, as though the very ground beneath him had begun to crumble. His mind spun in a million directions, trying to process what she had just said. But even more than that, there was a deeper question gnawing at him, a question that didn't want to be answered, but had no choice but to demand his attention. How had this happened? How had he been so blind to the life he had been leading outside of his carefully crafted world? How had he allowed himself to be pulled into a web of lies, deceit, and betrayal without even realizing it? And what kind of man was he, standing here now, faced with the consequences of his actions? The woman's eyes never left his, her lips set in a firm line. She was waiting for something, for an explanation, perhaps, or for an acknowledgement of the truth. But the groom was lost in his thoughts, his mind reeling. It wasn't just the shock of seeing her, of hearing those words. No, it was the overwhelming realization that this was a reality he could no longer deny. A pregnant woman stood before him, and she wasn't just anyone. She was carrying his child. He knew it with every fiber of his being, deep down. There was no mistaking it. The bride, still in shock, finally spoke. Her voice trembled with a mixture of anger, hurt, and disbelief. Is this true?" she whispered, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. The groom turned to her, his face pale, his body shaking. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. His throat was tight, his mind in a fog. How could he explain this? How could he explain something that seemed so impossible, so far beyond what he had ever imagined? The woman in the doorway didn't give him a chance to speak. She stepped forward again, slowly, deliberately, as though every move she made was calculated. The groom's eyes flicked back to her, panic beginning to set in. "I'm not here to ruin your wedding," she said, her voice quieter now but no less powerful. "I didn't want to do this, but I had no choice. The truth has a way of coming out, no matter how hard you try to hide it." Her words stung, not just because of their harshness, but because they were true. The truth had a way of surfacing, no matter how much we tried to bury it. The groom had known that deep down, he had always known, but now it was right in front of him, undeniable. And the worst part was, he couldn't escape it. Not anymore. "Please," the bride said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Tell me you didn't." The woman's gaze softened, just for a moment, before she shook her head. "I didn't come here to tear your life apart. I just wanted you to know the truth." The bride turned away, her back trembling with the weight of the moment. She hadn't been prepared for this. No one had. The whole world she had built, the dream she'd held onto for so long, was crumbling at her feet. And it wasn't just the groom who was guilty, it was the both of them. They had all been living in a world of lies. The room remained still, the guests silent, unsure of how to respond. Some had begun to murmur, their voices hushed, as though afraid to break the fragile tension in the air. The groom, his mind racing, knew that there was more to this story, more to the woman standing before him, more to the situation he found himself in. But that was a question for later. Right now, there was only one thing that mattered. He had to face the consequences of his actions. The life he had carefully crafted, the promises he had made, the future he had imagined, everything had been shattered in an instant. And no matter how hard he tried, there was no turning back. The room was heavy with the weight of unspoken words. The guests stood motionless, frozen in a shared, uncomfortable silence. The groom, still reeling from the shock of the woman's revelation, couldn't move. He stood there, his mind racing, his thoughts spiraling into confusion, disbelief, and guilt. He had never imagined that his life could unravel like this, not in a million years. The bride, her face a mask of shock and heartbreak, turned away from the scene, retreating to the far corner of the ballroom. Her hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the nearest table for support. Her mind raced, too, but in a different direction. How could this happen? How could he do this to her, on their wedding day? She had always believed in him, trusted him with every fiber of her being. But now, in an instant, everything had changed. And the woman, the one who had crashed their wedding with a pregnancy that could only belong to the groom, stood there, calm and composed, her expression unreadable. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't begging for forgiveness. She wasn't pleading for sympathy. No, she stood there as if she had come with a purpose, and she had completed it. She had exposed the truth, and now she was waiting for the fallout. The groom's breath was shallow as he turned to face the woman. His mind was still clouded, unable to fully grasp the gravity of the situation. He had always been careful. He had always prided himself on maintaining control, on ensuring his life was spotless, free of complications, free of mess. But this was something he couldn't fix with money or charm. This was something deeper, darker. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice hoarse. The woman didn't respond immediately. Instead, she took a slow step forward, her eyes never leaving his. The room seemed to hold its breath. The air was thick with tension, as though the very walls were closing in on them. "I don't want anything," she said quietly. "I didn't come here for you. I came here for her." She gestured toward the bride, who was still standing by the table, trying to compose herself. "I came to give her the truth, because it's not just my life that's been destroyed. It's hers too." The words stung. They stung in ways that the slap hadn't. The groom flinched at the rawness in her voice. It wasn't anger or bitterness. It was something much worse. It was resignation. "I don't know what you think you're going to accomplish here," the groom said, his voice tight with frustration. "This is insane. You're just throwing everything into chaos." "You've been living in chaos for a long time," she replied, her eyes flicking to the bride. "You've just been too blind to see it." The silence that followed was suffocating. It was as though no one could speak, no one dared to break the fragile equilibrium that had descended upon the room. The bride, still standing in the corner, finally spoke. Her voice was thin and unsteady, but it carried a weight that was impossible to ignore. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, her eyes locking on the groom. "How could you keep something like this from me? From us?" She shook her head, the tears that had been threatening to fall finally breaking free. "I've trusted you with everything. How could you do this?" The groom, his face ashen, could hardly bring himself to answer. The words stuck in his throat like shards of glass. There was no easy way to explain how it had happened. There was no way to justify the betrayal, the lies, the double life he had been living. But as much as he wanted to defend himself, he knew deep down that no explanation would be enough to heal the wounds he had inflicted on her. "I'm sorry," he finally said, his voice low and broken. It sounded empty, hollow. "I never meant for this to happen." But the bride, her eyes filled with an agony that twisted her face into a grimace, took a step back. "Don't apologize to me," she said harshly, her voice trembling with anger. "It's too late for apologies. You've already made your choice. I'm not some fool you can deceive anymore." The room fell silent again, the weight of her words hanging over them like an unspoken verdict. The woman with the pregnant belly stepped forward, her gaze never leaving the groom. "This wasn't part of the plan," she said, her voice suddenly sharp. "I didn't want this to happen like this, but you had to know. The truth always comes out, no matter how much you try to hide it." The groom didn't respond. He simply stood there, staring at the woman, his face a mixture of guilt and disbelief. How had he gotten here? How had his life, his perfect life, fallen apart in a matter of seconds? How could he have been so stupid? "I don't want anything from you," the woman continued, her voice quiet now, almost mournful. "I'm not asking for money. I'm not asking for your help. I'm just here to make sure you face the consequences of your actions. Because you're not just ruining your life, you're ruining hers too." She looked back at the bride, who had taken a seat at a nearby table, her head bowed, her face buried in her hands. The sorrow was visible in every line of her posture. It wasn't just the shock of the moment that had devastated her, it was the slow realization that her entire future had been built on lies. The woman turned back to the groom, her eyes hardening. "She deserves to know the truth. She deserves more than this. The groom opened his mouth, as if to speak, but then he closed it again, unsure of what he could possibly say. Nothing he could say would undo the damage. Nothing he could say would take back the pain he had caused. He had never been good at facing the truth, at looking it in the eye and accepting it for what it was. But now, he had no choice. The truth was standing in front of him, pregnant and full of consequences, and there was nothing he could do to change that. But there was something else, the uncomfortable gnawing feeling in his stomach. Something wasn't right. He had known the woman before. He hadn't recognized her at first, but now that she had spoken, now that he could see the faint familiarity in her eyes, it was all coming back to him. He had known her, years ago. They had shared a night together, a night he had long since forgotten, buried in the recesses of his mind. But she hadn't forgotten. She hadn't moved on. And now, here she was, crashing his wedding and revealing the deepest secret of his life. A chill ran down his spine as he thought of the possibility that this might not just be about a child. No, there were more layers to this. Much more. The bride, still sitting at the table, looked up at him, her eyes filled with confusion and betrayal. "Who is she?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The groom's heart sank. There was no easy way to answer that. There was no simple explanation. But he had to answer her. He couldn't run from this. He began, but the words caught in his throat. He couldn't bring himself to finish the sentence. He couldn't explain how one mistake from years ago had led them all here. He couldn't tell her that the woman in front of them wasn't just someone from his past. She was a reminder of everything he had tried to forget. But the woman, sensing his hesitation, stepped in. "She's the woman you slept with while you were with her," she said, her voice cold and matter-of-fact. "And I'm pregnant with your child." The bride's face contorted with pain, her eyes welling up with fresh tears. "How could you?" she asked, her voice breaking. "How could you do this to me? To us?" The groom's body trembled as he looked between the two women. There was no excuse. No defense. Only the painful truth that was now out in the open, raw and ugly. And as the room remained silent, the weight of the moment crashed down upon him. His life had been shattered. And there was no going back. The truth had been revealed. But it wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The wedding that was supposed to be the happiest day of her life had turned into a nightmare for the bride. The weight of the truth, the brutal, painful truth, pressed on her chest like an iron fist. It was unbearable, suffocating. She had never imagined that such a thing could happen to her. Her entire world, her vision of a perfect life, was crumbling before her eyes. And the worst part was, there was no way to stop it. No way to undo the pain that had already been done. The room around her felt like a distant echo, as though she was floating in some surreal version of reality. The guests, who had once surrounded her with smiles and congratulations, now looked on in stunned silence. Their faces were a blur, their words meaningless. The only thing that mattered was the overwhelming, suffocating truth that she had just learned. The woman, the one who had walked into her wedding like a ghost from the past, was carrying her fiancé's child. And she wasn't just anyone. She was someone from his past. Someone he had once shared a night with, a night that had been buried in the back of his mind, never to be spoken of again. But the woman had brought it all back. She had ripped open the wound that the groom had spent years trying to forget. And now, that wound was bleeding all over her. She couldn't bear to look at him. Not now. Not after everything that had happened. The groom, her supposed future, was standing in front of her, his face pale and haunted. He had betrayed her. He had betrayed everything they had built together. And she couldn't figure out how to move forward. How to even look at him. But he wasn't the only one she had to face. The woman, the pregnant woman, whose presence had destroyed the wedding, was still standing in the middle of the room, waiting. Watching. Her face was calm, almost serene, as though she was waiting for something else to unfold, something she knew was coming but had no control over. The groom, still stunned and shell-shocked, had barely said anything since the truth had come out. He had tried to speak, but the words had caught in his throat. Every time he opened his mouth, he found himself unable to explain, to justify, to make it right. He had never been good with words, never had been. But now, more than ever, he wished he could take back the years of lies, the years of deceit, the years of hiding the truth. He had thought he could bury it, move on, forget. But the past had a way of resurfacing, and when it did, it tore everything down with it. He turned to the woman, the one who had crashed his wedding and exposed him for the liar he was. His eyes were filled with a mixture of guilt, shame, and something else, something darker, deeper. It was fear. He was terrified of what was happening. He was terrified of the consequences of his actions. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice strained. The words came out more as a plea than a question. "I don't want anything from you," she said coolly. "I just want you to face what you've done." Her words hit him like a slap that was more painful than the one he had delivered to her moments ago. He felt the weight of her gaze on him, unflinching and steady. She wasn't angry, at least not in the way he had expected. She wasn't screaming, demanding retribution, or begging for his help. No, she was calm, almost eerily so. She was watching him, studying him as though she could see inside his very soul. And for the first time in his life, he felt completely exposed. "Face what I've done," he repeated, trying to make sense of her words. "What is it that I'm supposed to face? I've been living my life. I've been building a future. You're the one who ruined everything." A bitter laugh escaped her lips. "You think you've been building a future?" She shook her head, her eyes narrowing in disbelief. "You've been living in a dream world. You built your life on lies, on a false foundation, and now it's all coming crashing down. And don't think for one second that it's just about you. It's not. It's about her too. It's about the woman you betrayed, the woman you promised to love, to cherish." The groom flinched at her words, and the sting of her accusations cut deeper than he had expected. He had always been a man who believed in control, in power. He had always believed that he could handle anything, that he could fix any problem with enough money or charm. But this was different. This wasn't something he could fix. Not with all the money in the world. Not with all the charm he could muster. The pregnant woman turned her gaze away from him and back to the bride, who was sitting at the table, her face buried in her hands. The woman's expression softened, almost as if she were searching for some kind of empathy, some kind of understanding. "I'm not the enemy here," she said gently. "I'm not here to destroy your life. I never wanted to hurt you. But I won't let him keep running away from his responsibilities. Not anymore." The bride looked up slowly, her tear-filled eyes meeting the woman's. The tension in the room thickened. The groom, feeling the weight of their gazes on him, shifted uncomfortably. He didn't know what to say, didn't know how to fix this, didn't know how to make the pain go away. "I didn't ask for any of this," the pregnant woman continued. "I didn't ask for this child. I didn't ask for any of this drama. But the truth is, we're both caught up in it now. And we have to deal with it. All of us." The bride's voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through the tension with sharp clarity. "What do you expect me to do? What am I supposed to do with this?" She looked at the pregnant woman, then back at the groom, her face a mask of devastation. "You've ruined everything. All of it. The wedding. The future. Our future." The pregnant woman stepped forward, her expression softening further. "I didn't ruin anything. He did." She gestured toward the groom. "He made this choice long before I ever stepped foot in this room. He's the one who lied to you, not me." For a moment, no one spoke. The room was filled only with the sound of the bride's quiet sobs. The weight of the truth, of the consequences, was too much for her to bear. She had been betrayed by the one person she trusted most in the world. And in that moment, she felt as though her whole life had been a lie. The groom opened his mouth to speak, but again, the words didn't come. He wanted to apologize. He wanted to explain. But there was nothing to say. Nothing that could make this better. "I don't know what to do," the bride whispered, her voice shaking with raw emotion. "I don't know how to move forward from this. I don't know if I can forgive him." The pregnant woman looked at her, her expression softening, a trace of sympathy in her eyes. "You don't have to forgive him. You don't have to do anything you don't want to do. But you deserve the truth. And I'm giving it to you. You're free to choose whatever comes next." The groom, feeling the sting of her words, turned his attention to the bride. "Please," he said, his voice desperate now. "I'm sorry. I never meant for this to happen. I love you. I love you more than anything. I've made a mistake, a horrible mistake, but I'll do anything to fix it. Please don't leave me." But the bride, her eyes filled with a quiet fury, stood up from the table. She didn't say a word. She simply walked away. Her heels clicked sharply on the marble floor as she made her way toward the exit. The groom reached out as though to stop her, but the pregnant woman's hand landed on his arm, stopping him. "Let her go," she said quietly. "She needs time. And so do you." The groom looked at her, his face a mask of anguish. "I didn't want this to happen. I swear I didn't." The pregnant woman's eyes softened as she met his gaze. "You can't undo what's been done. All you can do now is face the consequences of your actions. And maybe, just maybe, you'll learn something from this. Maybe you'll learn that you can't hide from the truth forever." The groom stood there, paralyzed by the weight of her words. He had been running for so long. But now, the truth had caught up with him. And there was nowhere left to hide. The silence in the aftermath of the bride's departure was deafening. The groom stood in the middle of the ballroom, paralyzed, his mind racing as the reality of what had just transpired hit him in waves. The woman with the pregnant belly, whose presence had shattered his world in ways he couldn't even begin to comprehend, stood beside him now, watching as the last remnants of the perfect life he had built began to crumble to dust. He couldn't look at her. He couldn't bring himself to even face her anymore. His thoughts were a whirlwind of guilt and shame, emotions he wasn't used to feeling. He had always prided himself on his control, on his ability to navigate through life's challenges with ease, always in charge, always the one pulling the strings. But now, everything had spiraled out of control. There was no way to fix this. No way to patch up the gaping wound that had been torn open. The woman, whose calm demeanor had infuriated him at first, now felt like the only solid thing left in a world that was spinning wildly out of control. She wasn't angry. She wasn't frantic. She wasn't begging for sympathy. She had simply done what she had come to do. She had revealed the truth. And now, the aftermath was his to face. She turned to him slowly, her gaze steady, unflinching, as if she were studying him. His every movement seemed erratic, his thoughts jumbled, but she remained calm, almost disturbingly so. "You're a fool," she said quietly. The words, though harsh, were not angry. They were matter-of-fact, the truth spoken plainly. His eyes snapped to hers, his mouth opening and closing as though he were searching for something to say. But there was nothing. She was right. He had been a fool. A damn fool. And no words could make up for that. "Why," he finally managed, his voice hoarse. "Why did you do this? Why now? Why couldn't you just leave me alone? I've paid my dues, I've tried to move on. I've done everything right." She interrupted him, her tone sharp but not unkind. You didn't do anything right. Not for her. Not for me. Not for anyone. The words stung him like a slap, but they were true. He had been selfish. He had thought only of himself, never considering the consequences of his actions, never considering how the people he loved would be affected. He had acted without thinking, always with his own desires and interests in mind, and now the price was being paid. You think you've been paying your dues, huh? She shook her head slowly. You've been living in denial. You've been hiding behind lies and pretending like you could control everything. But the truth doesn't bend to your will. You can't just fix things with money or charm. The truth is bigger than that. His throat tightened as her words echoed in his mind. The truth. It had been standing in front of him all along, and he had refused to face it. Now it had come crashing down, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The pregnant woman looked at him for a long moment before speaking again, her voice softer now. She deserves to know the truth. I didn't come here to destroy her life. I came to give her a chance at knowing what she's truly facing. You've been living in your bubble, pretending that everything's fine, that the past is dead and buried. But it's not. You can't outrun it. And neither can she. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, to say something, anything, that might make it all go away. But he knew, deep down, that there was no defense for what he had done. There was no excuse for the lies. No justification for the betrayal. And no way to undo the hurt he had caused. I never meant for it to go like this, he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't want to hurt anyone. I thought it would be easier if I kept it all hidden. The woman studied him for a moment, her gaze piercing. Easier for you, maybe. But what about her? She nodded toward the door, where the bride had exited. What about the person you've been lying to? What about her heart? What about the trust you shattered? He couldn't answer. He didn't know how to answer. There was no excuse for what he had done. And now, there was nothing left to say. He turned away, his eyes searching the room as though he could find some kind of escape, some way to undo the damage. But there was no escape. The damage was done. The truth had been laid bare for all to see, and now he was left to pick up the pieces of his shattered life. You should go to her, the pregnant woman said quietly. She needs you. But don't go with lies. Don't go with any more of your charm or promises. She deserves better than that. He turned to face her, his expression one of disbelief. You want me to go after her? After everything I've done? After what I've said? Do you think she'll just forgive me? The woman didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. I don't know what she'll do, she said finally. But I do know that you owe her the truth. You owe her more than apologies. You owe her honesty. He didn't want to hear it. He didn't want to face what he had done. But deep down, he knew she was right. The only way forward, the only chance at redemption, was to face the consequences of his actions. It wasn't about salvaging his reputation. It wasn't about fixing things for himself. It was about making amends, for her, for the woman he had betrayed, and for the child who would soon be born into a world that had been built on lies. He took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. There was no more running from the truth. There was no more pretending. I'll go after her, he said quietly. But I don't know if she'll ever forgive me. I don't know if she'll ever trust me again. The woman gave him a long look, her eyes filled with something. Sympathy? Pity? It was hard to tell. She may never forgive you. She may never trust you again. But that's something you'll have to live with. And it's something you'll have to prove you deserve. The road ahead won't be easy. But if you want to make things right, you'll have to face the truth and own up to your mistakes. Only then will you have any chance of making things better." With those final words, the pregnant woman turned and walked away, leaving the groom standing alone in the center of the room, his mind reeling. There was no escaping it now. There was no running from the consequences. He had to face them, and he had to face them alone. The groom stood there, his body rigid, his heart pounding in his chest. The woman was right. He had spent his entire life avoiding the truth, hiding behind his wealth and his charm, thinking that he could control everything. But the truth had caught up with him, and now there was no escaping it. The silence in the room felt suffocating. His thoughts were a chaotic whirlwind, each one faster than the last, each one a reminder of the choices he had made. He had always been so careful. So calculated. But none of that mattered now. All that mattered was that the woman he had promised to love and cherish had learned the truth. And that truth had shattered everything. He had always known that the past had a way of coming back to haunt you. But he had never imagined that it would come back like this. His fingers tightened into fists as he stared at the door where the bride had walked out. He couldn't let her walk away. Not like this. He had to fix it. He had to make things right. Taking a deep breath, he turned and walked toward the exit, his footsteps heavy, each one a reminder of the weight of what he was about to face. There was no turning back now. There was no more hiding. The truth had been exposed, and now he had to face the consequences. As he reached the door, he hesitated for a moment, glancing back at the empty ballroom. His life, as he had known it, was over. But there was still a chance. There was still a chance to make things right. He opened the door and stepped out into the cold night, the weight of the world on his shoulders, and a future uncertain. The night air was cold, biting at the groom's skin as he stepped into the darkness outside the grand ballroom. The echo of his footsteps on the cobblestone driveway seemed to resonate with the chaos swirling inside his mind. Every thought felt sharp, every emotion raw, like shards of glass cutting through his chest. His hands trembled slightly as they shoved deep into his coat pockets, the weight of everything he had just learned, and everything he had done, pressing down on him. He had walked away from his future tonight. He had walked away from the woman who had been the center of his world for years. And no matter how many times he told himself it was her fault, her betrayal, her inability to understand, a part of him knew the truth. This was his doing. The woman who had walked into the wedding with the bombshell revelation was right. He had tried to bury the truth for so long, convinced that his wealth and charm would be enough to fix anything. But now, standing alone under the vast sky, he realized how far off the mark he had been. The truth had shattered his life. He had always thought he could control things. Control people. He had spent so many years building his empire, his reputation, his social circle, the perfect image of the wealthy, successful man, and he had done so by keeping secrets. By hiding parts of himself. But all of it had come undone in an instant. The facade he had built for so long had crumbled, and now, there was nothing left but the painful reality of what he had done. He closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. The sounds of the world, distant car engines, the rustling of leaves, the hum of the city far beyond, seemed distant, almost muffled, like he was underwater. Everything felt unreal. Yet, it was the most real thing he had ever faced. His actions, his decisions, the woman he had wronged, the bride who had loved him. He couldn't run from this anymore. The pregnant woman's words echoed in his mind, "She deserves to know the truth. You owe her more than apologies. You owe her honesty." But how could he make things right? How could he undo the pain he had caused? He could barely wrap his mind around the mess he had made. There was no way he could go back to his old life, not after tonight. But how could he move forward without the one person who had meant everything to him? His phone buzzed in his pocket, snapping him from his spiraling thoughts. He pulled it out quickly, his heart racing in his chest. It was a text from her. The bride. Where are you? The message was simple, direct, but it sent a jolt of fear through him. She was waiting for him. She wanted an answer. The truth. His hands hovered over the keys, but he couldn't find the right words. What could he say? How could he explain what he had done? He thought of the look in her eyes when she had walked out of the room. The devastation. The heartbreak. It had broken him. The woman he had promised to love, to cherish, to protect, had seen him for who he truly was. And it hurt more than he could ever explain. His phone buzzed again, this time with a call. It was her. He took a deep breath and answered. Where are you? Her voice came through the phone, tight with emotion. It was the same question, but now, there was an edge to it, an urgency, a plea that broke through the anger and pain. What are you going to do? He swallowed hard, trying to find the words. I don't know. I didn't mean for this to happen. I didn't want to hurt you. Then why did you? She sounded exhausted, as though the weight of her own emotions was too much to bear. He could hear the shakiness in her voice, the thin thread of control that was holding her together. Why did you do this? Why did you lie to me for so long? I don't know. I don't know why. It was easier to keep everything hidden. I thought if I just kept moving forward, everything would be fine. His voice cracked as he spoke. The lies that had kept him sane for so long now felt suffocating, like a mask that had slowly suffocated him from the inside out. You thought it would be easier, she repeated, her voice soft, almost broken. You thought it would be easier to destroy me? He could hear the tears in her voice, and it made his chest tighten. He had destroyed her. He had betrayed her in the most unforgivable way. He had stolen her trust, her future, everything they had built together. How could he ever expect her to forgive him? To trust him again? Please, just let me talk to you, he pleaded. I need to explain. I need to tell you everything. It wasn't supposed to be like this. You've said enough, she replied, her tone flat, devoid of emotion. I don't need your explanations. I need the truth. That's all I've ever wanted. But now, I don't know who you are anymore. The silence that followed felt like an eternity. He had no idea how to fix this. How could he make her understand? How could he make her see that he hadn't meant for any of this to happen? You were always so sure of yourself, she continued, her voice breaking. You always had everything under control. But look at where we are now. You've ruined everything. I can't do this anymore. I can't be with someone who isn't honest with me. I need to be alone. I need to figure out who I am again. He felt the sting of her words. He had never been this vulnerable, never had someone call him out for his lies in such a raw, brutal way. He had always been able to charm his way out of anything, to fix things with a smile or a few carefully chosen words. But now, nothing could fix this. Nothing could undo the damage. I'm sorry, he whispered. The words felt too small, too inadequate to cover the weight of what he had done. I never meant to hurt you. I know, she said quietly, her voice softening. But it's too late now. The line went silent, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. He could hear her breathing on the other end, the shakiness in her breath telling him everything he needed to know. She was crying. She was broken, and it was his fault. I need you to leave, she said finally, her voice firm despite the tears. Please. Just go. And with that, she hung up. The phone went dead in his hand, and for a moment, he simply stood there, staring at the screen. His heart was pounding in his chest, the weight of everything crashing down on him like a tidal wave. He had lost her. He had lost everything. He didn't know what to do next. He didn't know how to fix this. All he knew was that he couldn't let her go. He couldn't let this be the end. But how could he go back after everything? After the truth had come to light. After the lies had been exposed. Could he ever win her back? Could he ever be the man she deserved? He stood there for what felt like hours, the cold night air biting at his skin, the weight of his choices pressing down on him. The city felt distant, alien, as though he were standing outside of time itself. The life he had built, the life he had thought was perfect, was gone. And in its place was a profound emptiness, a void that felt impossible to fill. His phone buzzed again, pulling him out of his thoughts. This time, it was a message from the pregnant woman. "I know you're hurting, but she's hurting more. You need to fix this. But you need to be honest, with yourself and with her. No more lies. No more running." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He had been running for so long, running from the truth, from his mistakes, from the consequences of his actions. But now, there was nowhere left to run. He had to face what he had done. He had to fix this. If there was any chance of redemption, it started now. With a deep, shaky breath, he began to walk toward the hotel entrance. The night was cold, but it wasn't the weather that made him feel numb. It was the weight of everything that was lost. He didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know if he could make it right. But he had to try. He owed her that much. The sky above was heavy with clouds, the air thick with the promise of rain. The groom stood at the foot of the Grand Hotel steps, staring up at the building that had once been the site of his dream wedding. The lights inside glowed dimly, a stark contrast to the cold emptiness that had filled his heart ever since the bride had walked out. He had never felt more alone. He had tried to piece his life back together, tried to convince himself that the pain he felt was temporary. That it would all somehow work itself out. But now, as he stood here, facing the reality of his choices, he knew deep down that nothing would ever be the same. He had shattered something irreplaceable, and no amount of money, charm, or success could undo that. The woman with the pregnant belly, his former mistress, had been right all along. He had thought he could hide behind the walls of his wealth, behind his carefully crafted image, but the truth had clawed its way to the surface. And once it had, there was no turning back. No hiding. He had thought he could run from his past, but his past had found him, and now it was standing in front of him, demanding answers. With a deep sigh, he pulled out his phone, staring at the text from the bride, still unread. "Where are you?" How could he answer that? How could he explain himself when words felt so small, so insignificant in comparison to the damage he had done? He ran a hand through his hair, his mind spinning, his heart heavy with regret. His thoughts were a whirlpool, each one dragging him deeper into the storm. He couldn't fix this. He couldn't undo the hurt. But there was one thing he could do. One thing he had to do. He had to face her. He had to face the woman he had betrayed, the woman he had promised to love and cherish. He didn't know if she would ever forgive him, but he couldn't move forward without at least trying to make things right. The decision was made. He had to do it. No more running. No more hiding. No more lies. He walked toward his car, each step heavier than the last, the weight of his failure pressing down on him like a physical burden. As he slid into the driver's seat and started the engine, he couldn't shake the feeling that this would be the most important journey of his life. No matter what happened next, he had to take responsibility. He had to be honest. Not just with her, but with himself. The drive felt endless. The city lights blurred as he passed them, his thoughts fixed on one thing, the woman who had once been his future. The woman who had trusted him, loved him, and had been heartbroken by his lies. He had betrayed that trust, and now he had to face the consequences. By the time he arrived at her apartment, it was nearly midnight. The air was thick with tension, and the rain had started to fall in gentle sheets, the sound of it pattering against his windshield as he parked in front of the building. He sat there for a moment, staring at the entrance, his hands gripping the steering wheel. What if she didn't want to see him? What if she couldn't forgive him? What if it was too late? The thought hit him like a punch to the gut. It was too late, wasn't it? But if he didn't try, if he didn't face this head-on, he would regret it for the rest of his life. He opened the door and stepped out, the cool air biting at his skin. His heart pounded in his chest as he made his way to the entrance. Each step felt heavier, as though the weight of his mistakes was literally dragging him down. But he had to keep moving. He had to face the woman he had wronged, no matter the outcome. When he reached her door, he hesitated. His breath caught in his throat. He could hear the sound of soft footsteps from inside, but he couldn't move. Every nerve in his body screamed at him to turn back, to avoid this confrontation. But he didn't. He couldn't. With a deep breath, he knocked. The door opened slowly, and there she stood, her face pale, eyes red from crying. She looked different somehow. The woman he had known was gone, replaced by someone who was broken. Someone who had been betrayed by the one person she had trusted most. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was suffocating, the tension thick between them. He could see the pain in her eyes, and it nearly broke him. He wanted to reach out to her, to apologize, to tell her that he was sorry, but the words felt inadequate. What could he possibly say that would make this better? Finally, she spoke. Her voice was soft, hoarse from the tears. But there was no anger. Only sadness. You came. I had to, he replied quietly. His throat tightened as he looked at her, the words he had rehearsed 1,000 times suddenly feeling meaningless. I had to see you. I need to explain. She shook her head, taking a step back. You don't need to explain. I know the truth. I never meant for it to go this way, he said, his voice cracking. I never meant to hurt you. Her eyes softened slightly, but there was still a distance between them. But you did. You hurt me. And you hurt yourself too. I don't know what to do with that. I don't know how to come back from this. He nodded slowly, his heart breaking. I know. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even know if I can forgive myself. Then why are you here? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm here because I owe you the truth. I owe you an apology. I owe you honesty. And if there's any chance at all that you can ever trust me again, I need to be honest with you. About everything. She didn't say anything, but her eyes seemed to soften just a little, as though she was willing to listen, even if she wasn't sure she could forgive. He took a deep breath and began to speak, pouring out everything, the lies, the mistakes, the affair, the pregnant woman, the way he had buried the truth in the hope that it would all go away. He told her everything. Every detail he had kept hidden. Every choice he had made, every time he had let her down. When he finished, the silence that followed was unbearable. She didn't say anything at first, just stared at him, as though she were trying to process the weight of what he had just shared. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was calm, but there was a sadness there that made his heart ache. I don't know what to do with all of this. I don't know if I can forgive you. But I can't keep carrying this pain. I can't keep pretending like everything's okay when it's not. He felt a pang of guilt deep in his chest, but he nodded. I understand. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even know if I deserve it. But I'm here. And I'll be here, no matter what. She didn't say anything more, but for the first time since their confrontation at the wedding, he saw something in her eyes, something that wasn't anger, wasn't betrayal, wasn't the hollow emptiness that had been there before. It was something close to hope. Maybe not for them, but for herself. Maybe one day, we can figure this out, she said softly. But right now, I need space. I need to heal. And you need to heal too. He nodded. He understood. He didn't know if they would ever find their way back to each other, but he knew that this was the first step. The truth had been spoken. The lies had been exposed. And now, all that was left was the painful process of healing. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for giving me this chance to make things right." She gave him a small, sad smile. "I'm not sure what making things right looks like yet. But thank you for being honest." He turned to leave, but before he reached the door, he stopped. He didn't know if she would ever forgive him. He didn't know what the future held for them. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had done something right. He had faced the truth. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. As he stepped out into the rain, he looked up at the dark sky, feeling the cold droplets on his skin. The past had been painful, but it had led him to this moment. And now, there was a chance, a small, fragile chance, to rebuild. To learn. To grow. The journey ahead would be long, but for the first time, he felt like he could face it. One step at a time.